North Sea, February 1945. The sky was the color of wet concrete, a uniform gray that erased the line between cloud and water, and made the world feel like the inside of a sphere painted in shades of nothing. Inside the nose compartment of a B-17 Flying Fortress, designated Liberty's Lady, Bombardier Unit Number 447, Lieutenant Thomas Garrett sat hunched over a navigation table the size of a briefcase, surrounded by instruments that had stopped working 30 minutes ago when the electrical system took shrapnel from a flak burst over Bremen. The intercom was dead, the radio compass was dead, the drift meter was dead, and most critically, the flux gate compass that told them which direction they were flying had died with everything else, leaving them somewhere over the North Sea with no instruments, no radio contact, and no way to know if they were flying toward England or toward Norway, or in circles until their fuel ran out and they had to ditch in water cold enough to kill a man in 4 minutes. The pilot, Captain Eddie Morrow, had sent word back through the flight engineer that they had maybe 90 minutes of fuel left, which meant they needed to find their base or find any piece of land at all in the next hour, or they were going to become another statistic, another crew that disappeared over the North Sea and was never found. 10 men swallowed by gray water under gray sky and erased from the world as thoroughly as if they had never existed. Garrett stared at his navigation chart, at the last known position he had plotted before the instruments died, and tried to calculate where they were now based on time and estimated airspeed and the wind velocity he had measured 40 minutes ago, which might have changed or might not have. No way to know. The math gave him a rough area, a circle on the chart about 50 miles in diameter, which meant they could be anywhere in 2,000 square miles of ocean, and without instruments to correct their heading, they could be flying in any direction, drifting off course with every minute that passed. Standard procedure in this situation was to fly west until you hit land, but west was a guess without a compass. And if you guessed wrong, you could fly north toward the Arctic or south toward France and the Germans, and by the time you realized your mistake, you would be out of fuel and out of options. Garrett had seen crews make that mistake, had seen them disappear or turn up days later in German POW camps, and he had promised himself he would never let it happen to his crew. But now, it was happening, and he couldn't stop it because the instruments were dead, and navigation without instruments was supposed to be impossible. Except Garrett had been navigating without instruments since he was 14 years old, growing up in northern Maine, where his father ran a logging operation that required moving equipment and crews through forests that had no roads and no landmarks, except trees that all looked the same. His father had taught him to navigate by reading the forest the way other people read books, noticing the way moss grew on the north side of trees, the way water flowed, the angle of light through the canopy, the patterns of animal trails that followed the terrain. Garrett had learned to carry a map in his head, to build a mental model of the landscape and his position in it, updating that model constantly as he moved through the world. And by the time he was 16, he could walk through 20 miles of unmarked forest and come out within 100 yards of where he intended, navigating by dead reckoning and environmental cues and a sense of direction that his father called woods sense, and that Garrett just thought of as paying attention. When he joined the Army Air Corps in 1942, the navigation training felt almost too easy, because navigating with instruments and radio beacons and carefully marked charts was vastly simpler than navigating through forests, where nothing was marked and everything looked the same. And he had graduated at the top of his navigation class without really trying. But this was different. This was navigating at 200 miles per hour through three-dimensional space with no visibility and no instruments and 10 lives, depending on him getting it right. And for the first time since he was a kid in the woods, Garrett felt the cold touch of fear that came from being genuinely lost. He took a breath, forced the fear down, and started thinking through what information he still had. Because even without instruments, he wasn't completely blind. He still had his senses and his brain, and the training that had taught him how to extract navigation data from sources that most navigators never thought about. He couldn't see the sun through the clouds, but he could see the clouds themselves. And clouds had patterns, structures that indicated wind direction and weather systems and the relative position of land masses that created those systems. He couldn't feel the wind directly, but he could feel the aircraft's behavior, the way it drifted and yawed. And that behavior was a function of wind and airspeed and the pilot's corrections. And if he paid attention, he could extract wind information from the aircraft's movement, the way a sailor could feel wind direction from the way a boat handled. Garrett closed his eyes and tried to visualize their situation, building a mental model of the aircraft's position based on everything he knew. They had been over Bremen when the flak hit, heading west toward the North Sea, altitude 18,000 feet, airspeed 165 miles per hour. That was 30 minutes ago, which meant they had traveled roughly 80 miles, and the wind at that altitude had been out of the northwest at about 30 knots, which would have pushed them south, so they should be somewhere off the Dutch coast, maybe 50 miles out to sea. But they had been taking evasive action after the flak hit, which meant the pilot had been maneuvering, and without a working compass, those maneuvers could have taken them off the westward heading by 20 or 30 degrees in either direction, which meant the mental model had error bars the size of Belgium. Garrett needed more information, needed some way to constrain the possibilities and narrow down their position, and he needed it in the next 10 minutes or the fuel situation was going to make the navigation problem academic. He crawled forward to the bombardier's position in the nose, where he could see out through the plexiglass that gave him a view of the sky and the ocean below. And he spent 5 minutes just looking, trying to read information from what he could see. The clouds were stratocumulus, relatively low and uniform, which meant they were in a stable air mass, probably a high-pressure system. The cloud base was at about 8,000 feet, and the cloud tops extended up past their altitude, which meant there was no way to climb above them to get a celestial navigation fix. The ocean below, visible through occasional breaks in the clouds, had a particular pattern to its waves, a certain spacing and direction that indicated swell direction. And swell in the North Sea was almost always generated by Atlantic storm systems, which meant the swell should be coming from the west or southwest. And if he could determine the wave direction, he could get a rough east-west orientation even without a compass. Garrett watched the ocean through 3 different breaks in the clouds, memorizing the wave patterns, and he concluded the swell was coming from the southwest, which meant southwest was behind and to the left of the aircraft, which meant they were flying roughly northeast, not west like they needed to be. He crawled back through the aircraft to the flight deck and got Morrow's attention, shouting over the engine noise because the intercom was still dead, and he told Morrow to turn right about 40 degrees and hold it. And Morrow looked at him and shouted back, "You sure?" And Garrett said, "No, but I'm close enough." And Morrow nodded and banked the aircraft right, holding the turn until Garrett signaled to level out. And then they were flying what Garrett hoped was a westward heading, give or take 10 degrees, which was the best he could do without instruments. But 10 degrees of error at 160 miles per hour meant they would drift off course by about 28 miles per hour, and in an hour that would put them 50 miles north or south of where they thought they were, which could mean missing England entirely and flying out over the Atlantic until the fuel ran out. Garrett needed another data point, something to confirm his heading or let him correct it, and he spent the next 20 minutes staring out the nose at the clouds and the ocean and the empty sky, looking for anything that could give him information. Then he noticed something odd about the light, the way it was slightly brighter in one direction than another. Not enough to see the sun, but enough to see a diffuse glow through the clouds. And he realized he was seeing the sun's position, even though the sun itself was invisible, scattered light that marked where the sun was relative to the cloud deck. The time was 1630 hours, which meant the sun was about 20 degrees above the horizon and roughly southwest at this latitude and time of year. And if the diffuse glow he was seeing was southwest, then the heading Morrow was holding was slightly north of west, maybe 10 degrees north, which meant they needed to come right another 10 degrees. Garrett went forward again and gave Morrow the correction, and Morrow adjusted course, and they flew for another 15 minutes, while Garrett watched the fuel gauges drop and tried not to think about what would happen if his calculations were wrong. Then the radio operator, a kid from Chicago named Danny Witz, who had been trying to fix the radio for the past hour, suddenly came forward with a piece of paper and a triumphant expression and handed it to Garrett. The paper said, "Got radio working for 30 seconds. Picked up BBC home service. Signal bearing 275 degrees. Approximate range 40 to 50 miles. Garrett felt his heart rate spike, because that was exactly the information he needed. A radio bearing to a known transmitter. And if the BBC home service was bearing 275 degrees, that meant England was slightly south of due west, which meant his dead reckoning. Navigation had been accurate to within about 5 degrees, close enough that they were going to make it, close enough that the fuel would last, close enough that 10 men were going to live instead of die in the gray cold water of the North Sea. They broke out of the clouds 25 minutes later over the coast of Norfolk, and Morrow brought them into an RAF base called Horsham St. Faith because their home field at Ridgewell was socked in with fog, and they landed with less than 15 minutes of fuel remaining, which was as close as any of them ever wanted to come to ditching. After they shut down the engines and climbed out, shaking and grateful and alive, Morrow walked over to where Garrett was standing and said, "How the hell did you do that?" And Garrett said, "I followed the waves and watched the light and guessed a lot." And Morrow said, "That's not navigation, that's witchcraft." And Garrett shrugged and said, "It's just paying attention to things other people don't notice," which was true, but didn't capture the full truth, which was that Garrett had spent his entire life learning to navigate by building mental models and integrating information from every available source, and trusting his intuition when the data was incomplete, and that those skills had just saved 10 lives. The incident would have remained just another close call, one of thousands that happened during the air war over Europe, except that word got around among the navigators, the way word always gets around among people who do the same difficult job. And other navigators started asking Garrett about his techniques, about how he navigated without instruments. And Garrett tried to explain, but found that most of it couldn't really be explained in words because it wasn't a procedure or a technique, but a way of thinking, a cognitive approach that integrated sensory information and spatial reasoning and pattern recognition in ways that were mostly unconscious and intuitive. He could tell people to watch the waves and look for light patterns and feel the aircraft's behavior, but that didn't really convey the underlying skill, the ability to build and maintain a mental model of position and heading, and to update that model continuously based on fragmentary and uncertain information. But there was one navigator who understood immediately, a captain named Robert Novak, who had grown up sailing on Lake Michigan and had learned to navigate by dead reckoning long before he learned to use aviation instruments, and Novak started working with Garrett to develop a training protocol that could teach some of the skills to other navigators, not as a replacement for instruments, but as a backup system for situations where instruments failed or were unavailable. They called it environmental navigation, or EN, and they started teaching it informally to navigators in their bomb group, showing them how to extract heading information from wave patterns and cloud formations and light angles, how to use the aircraft's behavior to estimate wind drift, how to build mental models and maintain situational awareness when instruments were unreliable or dead. The training wasn't official and wasn't in any manual. Just two navigators sharing techniques with anyone who wanted to learn, and most of the navigators thought it was interesting but unnecessary because instruments were reliable and radio navigation was getting better all the time, and the odds of needing to navigate without instruments seemed remote. Then, in March 1945, 3 weeks after Garrett's incident over the North Sea, a massive raid on Berlin encountered a weather system that nobody had predicted, a violent front that knocked out electrical systems on dozens of bombers with lightning strikes and static discharge, leaving 89 aircraft scattered across northern Germany with no instruments and no radio contact and no way to find their way home. It should have been a massacre, should have resulted in dozens of aircraft lost to fuel exhaustion, or navigation errors, or mid-air collisions in the clouds, but instead 73 of those 89 aircraft made it back to England. And when intelligence officers interviewed the crews to find out how they had navigated home, they found that 41 of the returning aircraft had navigators who had been through Garrett and Novak's informal EN training, navigators who had used wave patterns and light angles and mental dead reckoning to find their way across 300 miles of occupied Europe and the North Sea without instruments. The survival rate for EN-trained navigators was 93%. The survival rate for navigators without EN training was 67%. The difference was 26 aircraft and 260 men who came home instead of dying or spending the rest of the war in prison camps. The Army Air Forces noticed the way they noticed anything that saved lives, and aircraft, and they ordered Garrett and Novak to write up their training protocol and submit it to the Navigation Training Command for evaluation and possible integration into the formal navigation curriculum. Garrett spent 2 weeks writing a manual that tried to explain in words and diagrams what was mostly intuitive and experiential. And he knew as he was writing it that the manual would be inadequate, that you couldn't really teach environmental navigation from a book any more than you could teach someone to ride a bicycle from a book. But he did his best, including sections on wave pattern interpretation and cloud structure analysis and dead reckoning techniques and mental model maintenance, trying to break down the cognitive processes into steps that other people could follow. The manual was approved and incorporated into advanced navigation training in May 1945, just before the war in Europe ended, and it was eventually refined and expanded and became part of the standard navigation curriculum for all Air Force navigators, teaching them backup techniques for situations where instruments failed or were unavailable. Garrett himself flew 28 combat missions and survived the war without a scratch, which he attributed to luck more than skill, and he stayed in the Air Force after the war ended, working in various navigation and training roles, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1962 after 20 years of service. He went back to Maine and became a high school math teacher, spending 25 years teaching algebra and geometry and trigonometry to teenagers who mostly didn't care, and occasionally produced a student who understood that mathematics was the language of navigation and that navigation was the art of finding your way through the world. He died in 2007 at the age of 84, and his obituary in the Bangor Daily News mentioned his Air Force career and his years as a teacher, but it didn't mention the North Sea incident, or the 89 bombers, or the environmental navigation training that had saved hundreds of lives and changed how navigators thought about their craft. But in the Air Force archives at Maxwell Air Force Base, there's a training manual dated May 1945 titled Environmental Navigation Techniques for Instrument-Out Scenarios, authored by First Lieutenant Thomas J. Garrett and Captain Robert M. Novak. And the introduction to that manual contains a paragraph that reads, "Navigation is fundamentally the art of knowing where you are and where you are going. And while instruments are invaluable tools for achieving this knowledge, they are not the only source of information available to the skilled navigator. The environment itself contains navigation data in the form of wave patterns, cloud structures, light angles, and aircraft behavior. And the navigator, who learns to read this data, can maintain situational awareness and navigate effectively, even when instruments fail." This manual presents techniques for environmental navigation that supplement rather than replace instrument navigation, providing backup capabilities that may save lives and aircraft in emergency situations. The manual has been updated and revised many times since 1945, as navigation technology has evolved from radio beacons to inertial navigation systems to GPS, but the core concepts that Garrett and Novak developed remain part of the training because the fundamental principle hasn't changed. Instruments fail, technology breaks down, and when everything else is gone, you still have your senses and your brain and the environment around you. And if you know how to read that environment, you can find your way home. Modern Air Force navigators learn GPS and inertial navigation and terrain following radar but they also learn to read wave patterns and cloud formations and light angles, to build mental models of their position, and to maintain situational awareness through multiple information sources. And somewhere in that training is an echo of Thomas Garrett, standing in the nose of a B-17 over the North Sea, watching the waves and the light and building a mental map that would bring his crew home. The broader lesson extends beyond navigation to the nature of expertise and the relationship between technology and skill. The question of what happens when we become so dependent on instruments and algorithms that we lose the ability to function without them. Garrett's environmental navigation worked because he had spent his life learning to navigate by reading the world, building cognitive skills that didn't depend on technology. And when the technology failed, those skills remained, providing a backup system that saved his life and eventually saved hundreds of other lives. We live in an age of unprecedented technological capability, where GPS can tell you your position to within a few meters, anywhere on Earth, where smartphones have more computing power than the entire Apollo program, where we have automated systems that can fly aircraft and drive cars and navigate through environments too complex for humans to consciously process. But technology fails, batteries die, signals get jammed or lost, and when that happens, we fall back on human skill and judgment and the ability to improvise with whatever resources remain. And if we haven't maintained those human capabilities, if we've let them atrophy through disuse, then we're helpless when the technology fails. The military understands this in a way that civilian society often doesn't, because the military operates in environments where technology regularly fails, under stress, and where the consequences of failure are measured in lives lost. And so military training emphasizes backup systems and redundant capabilities and the maintenance of basic skills that don't depend on technology. A pilot learns to fly with instruments, but also learns to fly without them. A navigator learns to use GPS, but also learns dead reckoning and celestial navigation. A soldier learns to communicate by radio, but also learns hand signals and runners. Because in combat, you can't assume anything will work, and you need to be able to accomplish your mission even when everything has gone wrong. That philosophy, that emphasis on resilient capabilities and human skill is what led the Air Force to incorporate Garrett's environmental navigation into their training program and to maintain it across decades of technological advancement, recognizing that the technology is a tool, but the skill is the foundation. There's a photograph in the National Archives, cataloged under 8th Air Force Operations, 1944 to 1945, that shows a group of navigators gathered around a table in what appears to be a briefing room, studying charts and taking notes, and in the corner of the photograph, partially obscured by another person, is a young lieutenant who might be Thomas Garrett, though the image quality is poor and the identification is uncertain. The photograph was taken by an Army Signal Corps photographer whose name is lost to history, and it survives because someone filed it properly in an archive that was maintained and preserved and eventually digitized, part of the vast documentary record of the war that fills warehouses and servers and contains millions of images and documents that nobody looks at anymore, except occasionally a researcher or a historian who is trying to understand what happened and why it mattered. The photograph shows a moment in time, a group of men learning skills that would help them survive a war, and embedded in that moment is a whole cascade of decisions and circumstances that led to the creation of an environmental navigation program that saved lives and changed training doctrine and persists today in modified form in Air Force navigation training. The story of Thomas Garrett is the story of countless other men and women whose names don't appear in history books, but whose skills and innovations and acts of courage determined outcomes that are attributed to generals and presidents and the great impersonal forces of history. Wars are won by the accumulation of small victories, by soldiers and sailors and airmen who do their jobs with skill and determination, and who improvise solutions when circumstances require it, by people who pay attention and think clearly and act decisively when everything is going wrong. Garrett didn't invent navigation or discover any fundamental new principles. He just applied skills he had learned as a kid in the Maine woods to the problem of navigating a bomber over the North Sea. And then he shared those skills with other people who used them to save their own lives and the lives of their crews. And the ripple effects of that sharing extended across decades and continents and eventually became embedded in the training that all Air Force navigators receive. That's how change happens in military organizations and maybe in all organizations, not through top-down mandates or grand strategic plans, but through bottom-up innovation and the sharing of practical knowledge and the recognition that people who actually do the work often know more about how to do it better than the people who write the manuals. The navigators who learned environmental navigation from Garrett and Novak and survived the war went on to careers in aviation and business and education, and some of them taught the techniques to others, and some of them forgot about it once the war ended and GPS made navigation trivially easy. But all of them remembered the moment when their instruments failed and they had to rely on their wits and their training and whatever they could figure out from looking at the waves and the clouds, and some of them told their children and grandchildren about it, and some of them didn't, and the story gradually faded into the general background of war stories that every generation tells, and the next generation half remembers. But the technique survived in the training manuals and the institutional memory of the Air Force, maintained and updated and passed down through generations of navigators who learned it and mostly never used it, but who understood that it was there as a backup, as insurance against the failure of technology, as a reminder that human skill and judgment still mattered even in an age of sophisticated instruments and automated systems. Thomas Garrett died quietly in a hospital in Bangor in 2007, surrounded by family, his mind mostly clear until the end, though he sometimes confused recent events with memories from the war, sometimes thought he was back in the nose of a bomber over Germany, watching the clouds and calculating headings and trying to bring his crew home. In his final days, he talked about navigation, about the importance of knowing where you are and where you're going, about paying attention to the environment and trusting your instincts and not relying too much on instruments because instruments can fail. And his family listened and nodded and didn't fully understand, but recognized that these things mattered to him and that they were connected to some essential part of his identity that had been forged during the war. After he died, his daughter found a box in his attic containing his old navigation logs and training materials, and a photograph of his crew standing in front of Liberty's Lady. 10 young men who look impossibly young, and she donated it all to the Air Force Museum, where it was cataloged and stored, and mostly forgotten. Another small piece of a vast historical record that documents a war that ended 60 years ago, and that grows more distant with each passing year. But the lessons remain, embedded in training programs and institutional practices, and the collective memory of organizations that understand the value of resilient capabilities and human expertise. The next time a navigation system fails, the next time a pilot or navigator has to figure out where they are and where they're going without instruments, they'll fall back on skills that trace their lineage to Thomas Garrett, standing in the nose of a B-17 over the North Sea, reading the waves and the light and building a mental map that saved his life and eventually saved hundreds of others. That's legacy, not the kind that gets monuments or medals, but the kind that persists in practical knowledge and shared skills, and the continued survival of people who benefit from innovations they never knew existed. That's how expertise propagates through time and across generations, through teaching and practice, and the maintenance of skills that seem archaic until the moment they become essential. And in that propagation, there's a kind of immortality, a way of continuing to save lives and solve problems long after you're gone.